Hello, everyone. My name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is called Meeting the Aliens 5 Onboard UFO Encounters. I think the onboard UFO encounter is probably the ultimate type of UFO encounter, certainly more extensive than a simple sighting or a close encounter of the second or third kind. I mean, meeting a humanoid face to face is certainly one thing, but being taken on board is quite another. These are really such close encounters that it removes any chance of misperception whatsoever. You are literally surrounded by the UFO phenomena. It's something you hear, taste, smell, feel, uses all your senses. And these are the cases, of course, with the most data that have the most to tell us about what it's like to have contact, who the ETs are, why they're here, where they come from, and all the many questions surrounding UFO contact. So yeah, I love these cases most of all, and I've chosen 5 today that I think you probably haven't heard before. They're really quite obscure, most of them, and super interesting. Now, what's interesting about these cases is they reach all the way back to the 1930s, the earliest case, and the latest is 1991, so quite a long period of time here. These cases do come from all over the world. I've chosen a case from Japan, one from the United States, one from Germany, one from Hungary, and one from Argentina. So quite a large geographical spread there. Now, the vast majority of these 4 are single witness cases. One does involve multiple witnesses, though the other witnesses do not recall being taken on board. And I will say that some of these do have peripheral witnesses, in that there were people in the area who saw UFOs at the time the main witness, was taken on board. And pretty much all of them involve one form of evidence or another to help support their case. And all were professionally researched as well by experienced investigators, which always adds another level of credibility to them. What I find most interesting about all 5 of these cases is that not one of them involves the use of regressive hypnosis. I do think hypnosis works when done correctly. I think the cases recalled under hypnosis show this because they match pretty much exactly what people consciously recall. But just avoiding any explanations of, oh, this is hypnosis, this is false memory syndrome, they made this up. Nope, you cannot say that in these cases because these are all recalled fully consciously. And yeah, there's evidence as well. I think these cases have lots of insight to them, lots to say about what it's like to have contact, and they're just super interesting because they are really the ultimate type of UFO encounter. So, the first case I'd like to talk about today, I call the Case of Warabe Amanaka. This case took place in Matsuyama, Japan, all the way back on August 2nd, 1930. This is a very unusual case. It's a bit different than most, but there are some elements to it that certainly match up with other cases. It does have some really interesting evidence to it, but the whole account is just a fascinating series of events, which I think you'll find quite interesting. This astonishing and very early onboard UFO encounter comes from Japanese researcher Hachiro Kubota. The witness is Warabe Amanaka, though this is a pseudonym. Like many contactees, he had a series of contacts while a very young boy. In fact, Warabe's first unusual experience occurred on a warm summer evening in 1926 when he was just 2 years old. He was in bed in his home in Matsuyama when he felt a sudden and strange feeling of goodness overwhelming him, and he heard someone calling out to him mentally, "Come out, my boy." It may sound unusual that he remembers all the way back to 2 years old, but this is something many contactees do report. At any rate, Warabe says he went outside, where he was greeted by a 6.5-foot tall, young-looking, human-looking Caucasian man with short-cut golden hair and wearing a white robe and white shoes. He had very large eyes, very smooth, hairless skin. He was very friendly. He smiled gently and spoke in Japanese, told Warabe, "Let me hold you, boy." Then they proceeded to take a short walk around the house. Now, Warabe says he felt no fear. The man was very warm, very caring, and that was basically it. But the next summer it happened again. This friendly stranger appeared, once more beckoning to Warabe, using mental telepathy to come outside and greet him. The meeting was entirely friendly, and it happened again the next year and the next. And in fact, from 1926 to 1929, there were a total of at least 3 meetings. Warabe called this gentleman uncle, as he didn't know his name. But on a few occasions, this man, uncle, gave Warabe gifts. Once he gave him a bicycle. During another visit, he actually gave Warabe a small metallic box, which you can see here, with a carving on the top. The carving, as you see, has a triangle in the middle, 2 small snakes rising up on either side of the triangle, all of it surrounded by this rectangle with a series of vertical lines and a sort of sunburst surrounding it. So this is a physical artifact which, as far as I know, has not been tested in any way. At any rate, all of this appeared to be in preparation for a major onboard experience, because it was on the evening of August 2nd, 1930, that Warabe, now 5 years old, was just beginning to fall asleep when he heard the familiar telepathic message, "Come out, my boy." So Warabe very much enjoyed these visits and eagerly went out to meet Uncle again. And Uncle said, "Come along with me, boy." Warabe said, "All right," and together they walked away from the house out into a large field. And to Warabe's surprise, there was a very large craft sitting in the field. Now, it was pretty dark, so he didn't get a great look at what it appeared to be. He didn't see much detail, but he estimates that this object was about 120 feet across. And as he watched, a door opened, and Uncle went inside, and Warabe followed. Once inside the craft, the witness saw 5 other tall men, very similar in appearance to Uncle. One was slightly shorter and wore a light brown jumpsuit with a wide belt and brown shoes. This man had long blonde hair and looked to Warabe Japanese. Now everyone gave him a friendly greeting. Warabe himself was given a long white robe with no sleeves and white sandals, similar to what the others wore. After he put this on, he was put into a little seat and strapped down with what appears to be a kind of seatbelt. According to Warabe, this room was quite spacious. It had large elliptical windows, milky white walls, floor and ceiling. All of it was the same color. He said it was dimly illuminated, so he couldn't see many details about the room, but he did see a 6-foot wide central column which looked almost translucent. I found this detail particularly interesting because this is something many contactees do describe, a central column in the craft. Then, at this point, Uncle told the witness, quote, "We are going to take you wherever you want to go." So needless to say, this delighted 5-year-old Warabe, and he said, "I want to see elephants and whales." And Uncle said, "All right, we will go to where the elephants and whales are." And the next thing the witness knew, the craft was taking off quite quickly, silently. He could tell because looking outside, he was amazed to see dark space. He didn't feel any actual movement, but after a few moments, he was surprised to see the sun coming up over the horizon. And he could see that they were very high up in the atmosphere. They flew for what seemed to him almost an hour over the ocean, when suddenly Uncle told him, "Boy, some whales are swimming. Look down at them." So Warabe got up from the chair and looked out through the portholes, looking down, and because they were so high up, the whales looked very small to him, and he was disappointed. And he told Uncle, "I thought whales were very big, but now they are rather small. I want to see big ones." And Uncle said, "Okay, we are going down a little more." At this point, the craft dropped down, and Warabe became very excited because now he could see these whales close up, and they were huge. And as he said, "Wow, how big they are! Great!" So Uncle looked down at him with a very pleasant smile, and they watched the whales for a little while, and then the craft took off again over a vast desert area this time. And Warabe was delighted to see this grassy plain and a crowd of elephants stomping around and raising clouds of dust. But again, he was a little disappointed to see that they were very small and off in the distance. And he said, "Uncle, I want to see bigger elephants." At which point Uncle replied, "All right, we are going down a little more." At this point the craft descended slowly, and Warabe was delighted to get a close-up view of these elephants, who were stomping around, swinging their trunks, flapping their ears. He noticed that some appeared to see the craft and were looking up directly at it. Later in life, he believed that this was probably Africa, somewhere in Africa. Now, while he was on the craft doing all this, he was given, on a few occasions, cold, sweet juice to drink. And then, without any prompting, the craft suddenly took off again. Looking out the windows, Warabe was amazed at what he saw. He saw pyramids, which he later recognized as the pyramids of Egypt. And in fact, the craft landed on a hill, which he estimates was about 150 feet high, not far away from the pyramids, giving him a very close-up view of them. Now, many, many years later, as an adult, he went and visited the pyramids of Egypt with his wife and recognized the very hill where the craft had landed on when he was just a little boy. So the entire onboard experience was very benevolent, just all about going and showing him all these different sights. And it took up pretty much the entire night, he estimates, because the next thing he knew, the craft returned to his home in Matsuyama, and as Warabe was about to exit the craft, Uncle told him something very interesting, which didn't make any sense to him at the time. But Uncle said, "My boy, your father is Abraham. You are Abraham's son. You must bear it well in your mind." So yeah, this really didn't make a whole lot of sense to him, but he never forgot it. At this point, Uncle led Warabe back to his home. Warabe rushed inside and saw that it was now 5 a.m. And boy, did he surprise his family, because it turned out his parents, his entire family, and really the entire neighborhood was frantic with worry because they had discovered that Warabe was missing early that evening. And they couldn't find him. Even searching the whole neighborhood, they could not find him. So now he appears in the house. Warabe's father is furious and asked him angrily, "Where have you been?" Warabe very honestly related his amazing adventure, but to his disappointment, nobody believed him. And from that point on, he became labeled as something of a liar and a sleepwalker. So he learned very early on, it's probably a good idea to keep your experiences secret. Now, 1 year later, August 2nd, 1931, he was laying in bed when he heard that familiar telepathic call from Uncle. He ran outside, was greeted by Uncle, and led to the same field where this same craft rested in the same spot. And Uncle said, "My boy, where do you want to go?" Now, Warabe was now 6 years old. He was about to go to school for the first time, so he was very interested in that and said, "I want to fly to my elementary school." Uncle said, "All right, we will fly there." So they went inside. The school was less than a mile away from Warabe's home, so the saucer rose up and went to the school, circled around it several times for about 15 minutes, and then Warabe was returned home. Uncle promised that there would be future visits, but alas, this was not to be. This turned out to be Warabe's last and final onboard encounter. However, in confirmation of the August 2nd encounter, there was, in fact, another witness. It turned out that 16-year-old Toshio Fujita, a resident of Matsuyama, told researcher Hachiro Kubota that on that night he saw a large elliptical object flying over the village around the time of Warabe's encounter. So yeah, as many experiencers do, Warabe kept his encounters secret for much of his life, finally speaking out with researcher Hachiro Kubota at age 61. But this encounter affected him profoundly for the rest of his life. He became a scientist and spent the remainder of his life in his hometown of Matsuyama, hoping that one day his friends from space would return. He became an impassioned environmentalist and really enjoyed nature. I think you'll agree that is a very unusual encounter, and I certainly don't blame the witness for not stepping forward for decades, especially considering the climate surrounding this subject can be quite hostile at times. But again, he does have some peripheral corroborating witnesses, some apparent physical evidence. Much of what he describes is described by other contactees. And again, it was researched by an experienced investigator. So I think it's an important case. That's why I included it. And it's certainly not well known. Now, here's the next case I'd like to cover today, which is very interesting for a number of reasons. Contact is rarely a singular event, and we see that in these cases, and certainly in this one, which I call the case of Nicholas Henry Edwards. Like many witnesses, he kept his experiences secret for a very long time, but finally decided to go public, contacted a number of very prominent researchers who looked into his case and found it quite credible. His main onboard event, and there were several, but his most well-remembered and extensive one occurred on November 15, 1959, while driving near Marysville in California. It's an incredible case. Got quite a few corroborating witnesses, some interesting evidence as well, and I certainly think you'll find it fascinating, and it does deserve to be more well-known. Now again, most people who are taken on board a UFO have a lifetime of encounters, and that's certainly true of Nicholas Henry Edwards of Tacoma, Washington. He has had many unusual experiences. In fact, at age 5 in 1948, while he was lying on the grass at the University of Puget Sound in Washington, he experienced what he believes is a profound out-of-body experience where he flew among the stars. And unusual experiences continued. One evening in July of 1952, while living in Point Defiance Park north of Tacoma, he saw a strange light bulb-shaped object moving back and forth in the sky. He drew it, as you can see. The next thing he knew, he found himself in a different place. So he was apparently taken on board. And as Nick says, I was scared. I saw many small aliens. They seemed to be talking, but I couldn't understand them. Their sounds. They seemed to be looking at me, but from a distance. It didn't look like a room, just white. I couldn't see walls. I felt like I was sitting on a stool. So his recall is not entirely complete here. He doesn't think that anything happened to him other than being taken on board apparently and seeing these ETs. But he did arrive home about 11 p.m. This experience started at 9:30, so there may have been some things, he admits, that he does not remember. And other weird experiences would follow. As a young pre-teen and teenager, he would occasionally see an aura of light surrounding his body. Nobody else seemed to notice it. On a few occasions, he would suddenly fall into kind of a trance, he says, and would start relating deep, profound spiritual information to people. Once in 1952, he was in his backyard with his parents and his brother Tom when a UFO showed up. All four of them watched it for about 2 hours as it moved high up, disappearing in and out of the clouds. But Nick's most memorable and dramatic experience occurred on November 15, 1959. At that time, Nick was 16 years old, and he and his two friends were driving along U.S. Highway 99 between Chico and Marysville, California. It was about 4 a.m. They were about 100 miles from Sacramento when suddenly Nick found his car being pulled up into a UFO. He looked over and his two friends were unconscious. And I'll just let Nick describe in detail, in his own words, what he saw. Says Nick, "I never forgot about this. The aliens took me to a room on that night. The room was like an operating room. On the wall to the right were some instruments, like clocks. Coming down from the ceiling were 3 black cords with devices on the end, like lasers. There was a long, large table near the cords. I remember 6 aliens total. They were 4.5 to 5 feet tall. The eyes were large, like human eyes, but big. They were very friendly. I thought they were cute at first. I was given an examination. I will not elaborate about the deeper details, but everything works fine in a certain area. The spacecraft was about 50 by 30 feet high. It had 2 rooms, a left room and a right room. The car was in the left room. The aliens took me to the right room. I could see that the wall was kind of round where the car was, but didn't notice it in the room on the right. There was a kind of greenish mist where the car was, and a whitish mist in the room on the right. The alien took me around the front of the car to the right. I could not move on the operating table except for my eyes. The aliens had complete control over me. Communication was done by thought. I never did see their lips move. The aliens were very expressive with their eyes and with movement of their heads and arms. The aliens did walk, but floated at the time. I did notice to the upper left what appeared to be an instrument panel and could see 2 aliens, perhaps to the front and up to the left from the right room or operating room. This may have been the flight deck or control center. There were 3 aliens to my right and 1 to the left. And after a couple of hours, the aliens put me back in the car with my buddies. We were back on US 99, just outside of Sacramento, California. So yeah, he was moved some distance from where he was taken, and his friends didn't remember. But during his encounter, he did ask the ETs where they came from, and their response was interesting. They said, "We come from a place beyond your solar system." So somewhat vague, but certainly interesting. And he, like other contactees, actually remembers seeing this weird alien book, 2 in fact. And as Nick says in his own words, "I also noticed 2 large blue books. I saw pages of one book turning, but this was not done by me, nor do I remember one of the aliens turning the page. There was an alien standing by me at the time, but he was only watching me, and I don't remember having any communication with them." Now afterwards, he wanted to tell his friends, but he just couldn't. As he says, "I never told anyone. This has been my secret. I just couldn't get it out until now. My life was changed, never the same. I started drinking and was very hard to get along with, but I learned to live with it. This was locked up inside, deep down until now." So yeah, it took him many years to deal with this and to come forward. And in the years following this encounter, he says he had many really profound dreams about UFOs, about being on board a craft and talking to the ETs. Some of these were very vivid and repetitive dreams. In one of these dreams, the ETs told him, "The history of Earth is coming to a conclusion soon." He remembered going to another Earth-like planet, all kinds of stuff. Now, he did have a few other UFO sightings, and so did his brother Tom. In 1973, Nick and his nephew viewed a cylindrical UFO flying near a jet. After it left, they talked about it briefly, and his nephew said, "No one would believe it." But yeah, it took Nick about 29 years to start talking, and in 1988, he began to contact prominent investigators to share his story. He also signed an affidavit attesting to the truth of his encounter. He contacted Dr. Leo Sprinkle, who looked into his case and wrote back, quote, "It is obvious to me that your UFO experiences are similar to those of many other persons with whom I have talked, and you have come to similar conclusions about the possible historical, biblical, and scientific significance of these encounters." Nick also wrote to researcher Balogh, author of Measure of a Mystery, Abductions, and which was really the first statistical study of onboard UFO cases. And Ed Bullard said, quote, "I can see that you are one of a number of people with lifelong encounters with strange visitors. They are many and varied, and they also have a deep impact on the lives of the people they meet. Your report certainly makes this aspect of these visitations very clear." So Nick was very determined to get the word out about his encounters and speak with researchers. He also wrote to UK researcher Mark Birdsall, who wrote back, "I have read your transcript and comments regarding your experiences and beliefs. I found them very interesting and honestly written." So Nick ended up writing a small book himself called The Inevitable, which was all about his experiences and its implications. Nick does have a strong religious faith. He speculates that some of the ETs may actually be angelic in nature. He ended up writing articles for a few UFO journals sharing his experiences. And he writes that his encounters have been very benevolent, writing, quote, "These aliens I'm with look like humans. I am happy to see them and be with them." You can see Nicholas ultimately concluded that his encounters were very positive. It's an interesting case for so many reasons. Such a shame that he wasn't able to connect with the other witnesses who had that onboard experience with him, although apparently it probably wouldn't help much to corroborate his case, considering he recalls that they were in fact unconscious. So he appears to be the target of the ETs in this case, which is not unusual. We see this in case after case where one person is taken and others are basically put to sleep, or even all might be taken and the others won't recall anything because they were unconscious throughout the whole experience. But I like Nicholas's case because he did reach out to many really prominent researchers who found his case quite credible. I think that adds a level of credibility to the case and certainly deserves to be more well known. Now, this next case is super fascinating. I had never heard of this one before. And when I did find out about it, I'm like, wow, this is an interesting case. I call this one the case of Claus-Dieter Kaufmann. And this took place in the spring of 1960 in a very urban area of Frankfurt, Germany. It's an incredible case that did initially involve missing time, but the witness recalled what happened to him spontaneously after going to the doctor and finding out something very unusual about his physiology, as we shall see. This case comes from Illobrand von Ludwiger, and it was one evening around 8:30 p.m. in the spring of 1960 that 14-year-old Claus-Dieter Kaufmann was walking to his home on the outskirts of West Frankfurt, Germany. He had just gone to visit the movies, and he was walking by the Ackerman School and the athletic field behind it, as you can see here, when he noticed a strange star-like object hovering next to the moon. Of course, it was much lower, and looking at it, he was shocked to see that it had almost a Saturn shape. And it was large. It was nearly 1/3 the apparent size of the moon. And looking at it, he could see it was actually disc-shaped, with these sort of rings around it, and metallic. He says it glistened like, quote, iridescent metal. He could see this in the moonlight, and it was hovering just a few blocks away, he estimates, in front of the River Main. Now, he did have a box camera with him, but unfortunately there was no film in it. But he was able to view the object through the camera viewfinder and could see that this Saturn-like ring around the circumference of this object was actually composed of several rings. So as he watched, he noticed a strange whitish mist forming near the high wire fence to his right. And at the same time, he noticed a powerful beam of light coming down. Now suddenly, he himself was struck by this beam of light, and it was so quick and so bright, he didn't have a chance to even cover his eyes, and the next thing he knew, he lost consciousness. And when he woke up, he was still standing in the same exact place. The object was still in the same position in the sky. However, the moon had changed position. So some time had apparently passed, and he also noticed something else. He saw a few figures off in the distance moving very quickly away from him. His watch, it turned out, had stopped at 8:30, so he knew exactly when this experience occurred, but he was feeling quite disoriented, a little unwell, so he rushed home as fast as he could, and when he arrived, he found that his brothers and sisters were all already asleep, and it was around midnight. His parents were out at the time, but looking out the window of his home, he could still see this strange Saturn-like object, and watched as it emitted a short white beam of light which moved up and down. Then suddenly the object became dark orange, becoming darker and darker until it disappeared. So at this time, Claus-Dieter had no memory of the missing time, which somewhere around 3 hours or more. The next day he did suffer from a very strong headache and inability to concentrate. He also noticed a very sore spot on his lower spine near his hip, which upon examination appeared to be a minor puncture wound. But as time passed, he forgot about this sighting. He forgot about the fact that he had lost consciousness. The only reminder was this mark on his back, which remained periodically painful from time to time, and would always remind him of his strange experience with this UFO. So ultimately it kind of left his mind for decades. But it was 30 years later, in 1990, Claus-Dieter had to undergo spinal surgery at Offenbach Hospital. And to his surprise, the doctor told him that his x-rays showed evidence of a prior surgery, exactly where Claus-Dieter had found this puncture mark decades earlier, immediately after his UFO encounter. The problem was he hadn't had prior surgery, so this very quickly reminded him of his encounter, which he hadn't thought about for such a long time. And, as if on cue, his memories of what occurred during the missing time began to return. It took a while, he had to meditate on it, but before long he remembered much of what had happened during these 3 hours of missing time. So he now recalled seeing this Saturn-like object, being struck by this beam of light, but he says he didn't actually lose consciousness, but fell into sort of a trance-like state. And this is when he noticed, standing real close to him, were several figures. They stepped out of this misty area and walked up to him. He said they were each about 4.5 feet tall, dressed in skin-tight jumpsuits. They had little tiny silver boxes attached to the chest. He said they had small hairless heads, a small chin, nose, and mouth, but did have very large prominent eyes. He says their arms and legs were strong and muscular. He noticed that their feet or shoes looked like flippers with 2 toes. He says the figures did include both men and women, which he judged by the shapes of their bodies. And he says all the figures walked with a strange jerking gait, very fast and purposefully, holding their arms at sort of an angle, reminding Claus-Dieter of soldiers. So at this point he was still very much dazzled by this brilliant light that had struck him, but he sensed one of the beings asking him to come closer. So he started to walk towards them, he says under his own free will. He says he felt a great affection for this ET. Now a fence was still separating him from these figures, and he was about to climb it to get closer to them when the ET suggested that he just stand next to the fence, which he did, and suddenly Claus-Dieter felt himself levitating, being lifted upwards. And looking up, he saw that the UFO above him was growing closer and larger, and that he was being carried towards it. The next thing he knew, he found himself inside a yellowish domed room. It was illuminated with a bright yellow light, he said. He was seated in a reclined chair, which he says was very much like a dentist's chair. In front of him he saw a large round opening leading into another room. Facing him, standing by the wall, were several gray-green entities. Actually, they did have their backs towards him. He says they were holding onto what looked like handles on the wall and were pumping these handles up and down. He couldn't really tell what they were doing. He did see another type of ET, which he recalls filled him with fear, but he is unable to recall exactly what it looked like. But standing next to him was another figure who had very large eyes, with whites in the eyes and small dark pupils. He said it had leathery webbed fingers, which he stuck into Claus-Dieter's mouth, kind of pulling or yanking on his teeth. This caused the witness to feel somewhat nauseous. He felt them trying to loosen his belt and remove his pants, and during this time he could hear them talking, both male and female voices. And this is when he did have quite a bit of fear. He actually wondered if he was going to be killed. This brought him to tears, actually. But this is when he noticed another small gray being. He said it had an enormous bald head, huge brown-black, shiny almond-shaped eyes, wrinkled skin, a very thin mouth, no visible nose or ears. But Claus-Dieter sensed this incredible kindness coming from this being. And in fact, he says it seemed to be very curious about him. And it comforted him and told him that he would be allowed to return home. So this provided him some definite reduction of his fear. The next thing Claus-Dieter knew, he was being levitated through the air, exiting the craft, and being placed down next to the fence where this whole experience began. During this, he could hear but not see the sound of breathing behind him. He actually reached behind him and felt what seemed like a belt hooked to him, but suddenly a force pushed his hand back, he says. And at this point, Claus-Dieter did faint, and that turned out to be the end of his experience, and that was all he could recall. An amazing case. It's really interesting to me how he recalled it years after the event. That's actually not that unusual. That does happen. Sometimes people have what I call a cue, something that reminds them about the experience, and just sitting down and meditating about it can bring back the memories. And that's apparently what happened in Claus-Dieter's case, which is so interesting also because of the physiological evidence. The doctor telling him, well, it looks like you've had an operation, when he hadn't, or apparently he had, with the ETs. And again, this was an experience that he felt was ultimately benevolent. Just a fascinating case all around with so many different types of ETs and what he experienced while he was on board. And now we move to another really interesting case, which did get quite a bit of attention in the country where it happened, but I don't know if it's very well known outside of Argentina where it took place. I call this case the case of Gilberto Gregorio Coccioli. And this is an interesting case which took place on October 4, 1972 in Berzaco, Argentina. This has some really interesting evidence to it as well, physical evidence, animal reactions, certainly physiological evidence. It's a remarkable case that deserves to be more well known, with someone being pulled on board, seeing some very unusual type ETs, having some very interesting interactions with them. The main witness in this case is again Gilberto Coccioli, a 50-year-old construction worker. And it was around 3:15 in the morning on October 4, 1972, when he heard strange noises outside his home in Berzaco, which is located outside of Buenos Aires, Argentina. Now he first thought it might be his dog. His dog had a habit of escaping from the house and jumping the fence. It was quite a difficult dog to deal with. So he crawled out of bed, opened the door, stepped outside, and this is when he walked right into the strangest experience of his life. And I'll just let Gilberto describe what happened in his own words. So he steps outside, and as Gilberto says, when doing so, a very intense light dazzled me, and I lost consciousness. What I remember is waking up in a small room with a metallic appearance, with neither doors nor windows, nor any other openings that could be seen. Only polygonal pipes could be seen on the walls and on the roof of the room. The satin sky was like silver, very bright, like fluorescent lights, that because of their brightness it was impossible to look at them. I could not distinguish the range of colors I was seeing. There were many beings in the room and around me. Their exact number I cannot specify. They were 2 meters tall and 30 centimeters. That's about 7 feet, just under. But as he says, they were very thin. I believe they were no wider than 20 centimeters. Their gaze was strong, so much so that I couldn't look at their eyes. When I could look at their eyes, I saw that they were hollow and deep. The nose was wide and flattened, and the lips thin. They were covered in a kind of olive green uniform. It was like a diving suit. The inexpressiveness of their faces makes me think that they might have been masked. Their faces were very long. They had a wide belt with squares with flashing lights. So Gilberto became quite frightened, and one of the beings, the only one who was wearing any kind of headgear, spoke verbally, he thought at first. He later decided it was telepathic. But this being spoke to him and said, "Don't worry, nothing will happen to you." This did provide him some comfort, and looking at the figures, he could see that they were mostly human-looking, but did have very wide, very long chins. And yeah, after they continued to speak with him, he realized that they were actually speaking telepathically. He said the room that he was in was very large, brightly lit. It kind of reminded him of a scientific laboratory, because he says the walls and everything was made out of metal. He saw many strange, quote, apparatus and instruments, but he couldn't tell what they were. They were kind of beyond his ability to understand. He could see that he was sitting on a circular bench, which looked like it had colored lights on it. One of the beings took a small device, sort of like a suction cup with a funnel and a pencil-like extrusion on it, and took a small quantity of blood from the fourth finger of his left hand. This surprised him because there was no needle, nor did he feel any pain whatsoever. He said a sperm sample was also taken, though in a later interview he elaborated on this and said what actually happened was that there were 2 other women from the Berzacco area on the ship, human women, and that he was made to have intimate relations with both of them. Now, Gilberto did have the impression that the beings were entirely friendly. As he says in his own words, "These beings were very kind to me, and their voices were very sweet. While I was in that room, I heard children crying, calling their mother, but I don't know where that crying came from. It may be from some family, but I didn't see any in there. As one of the beings took my blood away, I looked around me, and so it was that I could see in the pavement some stones piled up." So yeah, he heard children crying. This could be from houses in the area is what he's saying. But he saw some weird piled up stones on the ship. And he was very curious about it and wanted proof of his experience. So Gilberto asked if he could take one of the stones. The being replied no. But then the being looked at one of the other ETs and then bent down and picked up one of the stones and actually handed it to Gilberto. Now before Gilberto took it in his hands, he asked if this stone contained any radioactivity. And the beings told him to just take the stone and that, quote, "nothing will happen to you." And this is when suddenly his onboard experience came to a quick end. And as the witness says, "I didn't have time to ask him if the stone was terrestrial or not, but I'm sure it belonged to our planet. It was iron pyrite. When I had the stone in my hand, I closed my hand and appeared again at home. I was calm, standing, stone in hand. If I hadn't had that stone, what happened would have seemed like a nightmare." So yeah, he had some physical evidence of his experience. You could see that it was now 3:55 a.m., 40 minutes had passed, and upon his return he also noticed something else. There was in fact a mark on his finger where this blood sample had been taken. He said the finger afterwards would swell up on and off for some time. He also noticed a minor pain at the base of his neck for about 3 days. After his encounter, he also suffered from vertigo and a sense of dissociation. In fact, as he says, "When I walked, it was like I was walking on air." I found that interesting because that is a description I've heard from many contactees. He noticed that his dog was somewhat traumatized and scared. It didn't eat normally for some time, and experienced what looked like bouts of semi-paralysis. Now, the stone given to Gilberto was in fact analyzed by his friends who worked as miners, and it again revealed itself to be normal, earthly iron pyrite. Still interesting though. The strangest effect was perhaps that Gilberto noticed an increase in, quote, intuitive sensitivity. He says he suddenly possessed a whole new understanding and knowledge of physics, astronomy, and philosophy, which was very unusual, as his education had never gone beyond primary school. Now, Gilberto says that he did actually remain in telepathic contact with the ETs. As he says, sometimes I feel a jingling noise back here on the back of my neck, and I know that they are calling me to communicate something telepathically. I actually saw them only once after that day, but I have communicated with them many times. They tell me many things that I cannot reveal because they won't let me. What an amazing case that is. And the fact that they gave him this rock, although it turned out to be an earth rock, it's still kind of interesting. His medical evidence is also very interesting. To me, the most interesting aspect is the psychological or spiritual and psychic after effects, with him suddenly becoming interested in all these really deeply philosophical and spiritual and scientific subjects. This is something we see. Apparently there's something about UFO contact that wakes people up in a number of different ways. Contact experience challenges people on multiple levels, particularly an onboard experience. It challenges them physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and psychically. So it's a really profound, peak, superlative experience that is often something people will remember for the rest of their lives. Now, let's move to the very last case of this little collection. I call this one the case of Istvan Balogh. This took place on December 26, 1991 in Beacon, Hungary. And this is a really interesting case. The witness is a young man who worked for the National Guard, so he was a border guard, and that I think makes him a very credible witness. Like many, he wanted to keep his experiences secret, and did initially when he started experiencing some very unusual events, but certainly couldn't hide it from his parents, who knew instantly something very profound had happened to him. As in all these cases, he was taken on board, had a very interesting interaction with unusual ETs, and as we shall see, some really remarkable proof of his contact. This case comes from researcher Gábor Tarkali of HUFON, the Hungarian UFO Research Network, and it involves a 21-year-old military border guard by the name of Istvan Balogh. This case took place in the town of Bécs in Hungary, and it was beginning on December 13, 1991, that Istvan was sleeping in bed when he was awakened by a voice that spoke 3 times in a mechanical tone, saying, "You will meet us. You will meet us. You will meet us." So Istvan was wondering if this was just some weird dream or nightmare, and at first really didn't think too much of it. But the next night, the same thing happened again, and the night after that. And in fact, over the next week and a half, for 11 nights in a row, he was woken up at the same time each night with this same message, "You will meet us," repeated 3 times. So this was absolutely freaking him out. He was afraid to tell anyone, thinking that he would not be believed, but at the same time, he began to dread nighttime, and he was barely able to sleep. And it all came to a climax on the evening of December 26, 13 days after he started getting these nightly messages. That night, he had gone with his friends to the movies, and he returned to his home about 15 minutes after midnight, and he had just opened the gate to his property and reached the terrace of his home when he noticed something hovering just a few meters above the ground in the courtyard. And as he looked at it, he could see it was a gray disc, about 12 feet wide and 7 feet high, and was glowing brightly. He said it had a weird squarish protrusion on the bottom, a domed top. There was a band around the center, the circumference, and what appeared to be a porthole along the side. Now, the moment he saw this object, Istvan says that something strange happened. He felt like he lost all his willpower, and as though some strange force propelled him to walk directly underneath this object. And the moment he did this, a beam of light about 2 feet wide shone down from the center, and unable to stop himself, Istvan walked directly into the beam of light and immediately found himself inside this UFO. Now inside the object, he was amazed to see 2 short beings. He said they looked pretty much human, but were very short, only about 4 to 4.5 feet tall. They had large heads, very large eyes, kind of a greenish skin, and long hands with only 3 fingers on each hand. Each of them wore black, skin-tight clothing. Now, one of these beings was operating some controls in the craft, while the other stood by Istvan, kind of attending to him. Looking around, Istvan saw no doors, only one small window, which he estimated was about 3 to 4 feet wide, and looking out the window, he could see his yard. The room inside the UFO was very bright, he said, with smooth gray walls. It was at this point that the being next to Istvan began to speak to him telepathically in his native language of Hungarian. This little guy said that they had been watching Istvan for 3 years, and they told him they were going to take him away on a trip of about 15 million light years, but that it would only take a very short time as they were able to travel interdimensionally. At this point, the being shone a green light onto Istvan's forehead. This caused him some disorientation, and following this, he doesn't really remember clearly what happened next. He does have fragmented memories of looking out the window and seeing what he believes was the moon's surface. He saw craters real close up. He also recalled seeing pyramidal structures, but does not know where these were, if they were on Earth or perhaps another planet. But the next thing he knew, he was kneeling on the ground in a sort of prayer posture, about 6 feet from the location where he had been taken, but still in his backyard. He did have a terrible headache. He said he was very dizzy, his whole body was trembling, the muscles in his face were distorted, he had trouble standing up, so he was pretty severely affected by all of this. He did manage to stumble into his house. He could see that it was now 2 a.m., so this onboard encounter had lasted about 1 hour and 45 minutes, of which he only remembers a little bit. He went straight to bed, but when he woke up the next morning, he told his parents, and they told him that they had not noticed anything out of the ordinary that night, but when they heard his amazing story, they absolutely believed their son because they could see he was in great distress. Now, Istvan had to go to work that day, so he went to the barracks where he worked, but he had to be driven there. He couldn't walk on his own. They called a doctor and he was actually driven to his job. And once there, he immediately reported to his superiors and told them what happened. Now, they did not believe him, and they sent him to the nearby hospital for a medical examination, and then he was sent to the psychiatric ward in the Central Hospital of Budapest. Now, thankfully, a psychiatric exam showed Istvan to be perfectly healthy, but despite this, he was discharged from his job as a border guard, and the official explanation was that he was, quote, unreliable and unfit for further military service. But something very interesting did result from the medical exam. Earlier in his life, Istvan had broken his arm and had to have a platinum rod inserted. However, when examined and x-rayed in the hospital, they saw that this platinum rod was now missing. So apparently the ETs took it. So there you go. That's the case of Istvan Balogh. And what an interesting case it is. And absolute proof of ET intervention given the fact that this platinum rod that had been inserted in his body by doctors following him breaking his arm was no longer there. So that's certainly something that can't happen by accident. It's really remarkable evidence. Such a shame that he was treated as he was by his superiors in the military, losing his job that way just because he had an experience. That's hardly fair, but certainly something we do see over and over again. People will have a UFO experience and as a result lose their job because of it. I did a whole episode on that previously on this channel, so you can check that out if you're interested. But what an amazing case. All 5 of these cases, I think, have quite a bit to tell us about the ETs, who they are, why they're here, where they come from, what they're doing on this planet and with us, and all the different types of ETs there are, how people react to contact, how people are treated because of their contact. Many really interesting insights into all of this from these cases alone, which, as I'm sure you know by now, represent only the very tip of the iceberg. Many, many more people are being taken on board UFOs than is publicly revealed. People are much more likely to talk about a simple sighting, but if they have face-to-face contact or are taken on board, they're very unlikely to talk about it. The vast majority simply don't, because, as we can see, reactions can be quite skeptical, hostile. People will ridicule witnesses mercilessly. This can break apart families and marriages. It's a real tough thing for a witness to go through, to have an experience like this and then have to deal with all these after effects in relationships and physically, and again, mentally, spiritually, all of it. It's quite an ordeal, but certainly a fascinating experience that many, many, many people are having. It's why I do this research, because so many people out there are having these experiences, looking for answers, and have no recourse. So that's it for today. I really want to thank you for watching. I truly appreciate it. Again, it's because of you guys that I do this research and am putting out these episodes. So thank you, thank you, thank you for watching. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions. Keep searching for the truth. It's out there. And most important of all, keep having fun. I will see you next time. Bye for now.